What is up, YouTube? Let's look at making better sample-based percussion loops for your tracks. So this is something that came up in conversation the other day. Something about, the fact that a lot of Psytrance has, very regimented percussion lines. It's often just kick, snare, hat, snare. And obviously there are sort of deviations from it. I mean, there are some guys that, really excel with percussion and stuff like that. And it dawned on me that I haven't showed you guys a technique that I often use for creating these sort of more authentic percussion style loops, rather than the sort of more synth-based stuff, which I think I've covered pretty extensively in the last few weeks and stuff like that. So I figured it would be a cool opportunity to show you guys this technique. The way I do it is in Cubase's Groove Agent, but the same concept can be applied to, Ableton's drum rack, or you can even do it on sort of raw audio samples on an audio track. So you're not limited to how you use this concept. There's various ways to pull it off, but I'm going to show you guys how I do it in Groove Agent. So yeah, let's dive in and have a look. So one of my favorite things about Groove Agent is it's got a very extensive built-in mixer. So it allows you to create an entire sort of submix of percussions without having to, add extra group channels and stuff and clutter up your actual project's mixer. So it allows you to do all sorts of like processing, and there's all sorts of built-in effects and stuff like that allow you to get really deep when creating these sort of sample-based percussion loops and stuff like that. So I want to show you guys a few key techniques that I use for creating these sort of these loops and stuff like that. I'm going to just sort of browse my library. I'm going to go through a bit of Loop Cloud, probably fast forward this process and just throw some random samples into Groove Agent. The actual samples that I'm using aren't really that important, but it's sort of the way that I route them in the mixer, and I'll get into that just now. Awesome, so I got a bunch of samples loaded up here, all sorts of random stuff, not from any sort of particular sound banks or anything. I kind of just, went wild through a bit of everything in here. There's sort of traditional stuff, there's sort of more digital stuff. I'm actually going to show you guys. So this technique can be used on a variety of different source sounds. It's pretty cool to actually create, I like creating a rack and then saving the preset, and then you can always just swap the sounds and stuff like that, but I'll show you guys a little bit later on. So these are some of the sounds that I've got loaded up so far. All sorts of random stuff, as you can hear. So the idea now is to use the internal mixer within Groove Agent to create various sort of group channels that we then group these different drums into. So let's go over to our mixer. So by default, you've got these four mixer buses that you can already choose to route these samples through. So what I like to do is I'll highlight, for example, 4 of them. I'm just going to do them in rows for now, just to make it a little bit easier. And I believe if you hold Alt-Shift, right-click, you can assign output. And then you go here, Agent, Bus 1. So now all of these drum sounds will be playing out of this submix here, Bus 1. So this is cool because now we can add some effects and stuff like that here. Maybe some different EQing and stuff like that. But the key thing here that I do is the panning. I usually group my sort of percussion sounds into 4 groups and then pan them individually. So it'll be like 1 on the left and 3 on the right, or vice versa, or 2 and 2, something like that. So I'm going to quickly assign these 4 rows to these 4 buses and pan them all individually. And I'll probably fast forward the process. Cool. That's so far so good. So here's where it sort of comes to creative taste and stuff like that. You can use various effects and stuff like that. I like to use some of the saturation that's built in, so you can really drive the sounds. So I'm actually going to group these into 4 and just apply all sorts of random effects and stuff like that and see where it takes me. Cool. So I've just put all sorts of random stuff. So it's distortion, tube compression, distortion, and frequency shifter. I try not to use too much reverb and delay and stuff like that, because I use that after the fact on the channel, usually to, once I've bounced out a couple of loops and stuff like that, but I'll explain the process shortly. So here, what I like to do is apply a slightly different high pass EQ to each one, so that almost what I'm doing is with each of the buses, I'm creating a different kind of panoramic and frequency sort of space for each of those drums to sit in. And you'll hear once we start sequencing the drums, you'll hear kind of the strength of doing that. Studio EQ is probably the easiest because you can just go like this and then sweep the frequency. So these are just rough settings for now. I mean, you can always go back and fine tune it once we've sort of put in the rhythms and stuff like that. It'll probably be a little bit easier to kind of see what's happening, or actually to hear what's happening once you've got like a groove going and stuff to the track. Here, what I'll usually do is, actually just going to drag this over here. I'll solo my percussion group, so I'm just kind of hearing the hi-hats and the snare. So now it's a little bit easier, you know, to hear the rhythm of what's happening in terms of the percussion. So I'll create a MIDI file and duplicate it, and then solo the groove agent as well, and then listen for the percussion and start filling in gaps in between, just randomly with some of the samples that we had placed into those different buses. The trick here is to try not use notes that are sort of too close together. That way you create a sort of juggling kind of effect. I'm going to play the audio while I do this process, and you guys are going to see what I'm talking about. So here's when you start noticing that some of them are probably sort of wildly louder than others. I think this one, for example, compared to this one. So because we've kind of submixed it within the program, within Groove Agent, it's just much easier to kind of jump in there and change the volumes. You can kind of see what's happening on each one while you're changing them, change the EQs and stuff. So this sample over here is pretty cool to use as, for example, something like a ghost note. But here, what we're going to want to do is alter the envelope of the actual sound. So what I do is, like, once I've filled up a kind of rhythm that's sounding good, I'll fill up all the other spaces with a single sample. Say, for example, like this guy. So here we've got a kick, here we've got a hi-hat, here we've got a snare. So here will be the missing space, here will be the missing space, here will be the missing space, if that makes sense. And then I'll jump over to the actual Groove Agent, and we can start playing with, I think it was this one. Go over to edit. We can start playing with each of the individual samples, kind of like envelope and volume and stuff like that, and get sort of really technical here. We don't want so much of a transient, but we do want a bit of presence there so that it's a noticeable kind of like percussion sound. You can also put like filters and stuff on them. So this is kind of like why I like to use Groove Agent for this, because you're still leaving your mixer relatively uncluttered for the actual project side of things. And then you can always save this preset and alter it or come back to it and change it a bit later in the project and stuff like that. It's sounding cool, but it's a little bit like kind of all over the place in terms of like the volume and the transients and stuff like that. I've explained this in various videos before. I like to use a compressor to kind of congeal all the sounds together so that they sound like they're coming kind of from the same machine or from the same drum or from the same instrument or whatever it may be. Cool, that's sounding good so far. I think I would use that. One thing I like to do a lot is I will put a bit crusher on here, and obviously I won't use it sort of as the final effect, but I will use the bit crusher along with a filter to kind of bring up the sort of momentum, along with, you know, maybe removing a couple of elements in the actual rhythm itself to bring up the actual kind of rhythm of the track in the different sections. So that's a cool way of creating a kind of like build up to where the sort of percussion and stuff drops in. I'll show you guys a quick example of like how I would maybe use that. Awesome. I hope you guys enjoyed that. Let me know what you think in the comments. A big thanks to IDM Mag, proud supporters of the dance music scene and my channel. There's not really much preset involved here, so I'm not going to be uploading that to my Patreon. But if you want to know what my Patreon is all about, head on over to the link that's in the description, or that should be on the screen somewhere around about now. As always, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. See you guys next time.